Perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our June Community of Practice session with Delilah Rothenberg and Tallant Meier. Thank you so much for joining us for a discussion on the TISFD. So we'll hand over to our guests this morning, and I'm going to share my screen for their presentation. So like I said, we will be having a breakout room session after the presentation, and you'll just be split into two different rooms with the moderator as well. So please give it your best participation and please ask any questions at all throughout the session as well. So sharing my screen now. Okay. Perfect. So Kate or Delilah, just let me know and I'll tip on to the next slide.
Great. Thanks so much, Ada. And also thank you, Radhika, who I understand is also supporting us on hosting this webinar. And thank you all for your interest in joining. As Ada mentioned, my name is Delilah Rothenberg. I'm a co-founder and the executive director of one of the organizations that's part of the working group working to launch the Taskforce on Inequality and Social-Related Financial Disclosures, or TISFD. My organization is the Predistribution Initiative, and my background is in finance, 15 years prior to starting the Predistribution Initiative, with the first 4 in public equities, and the remainder in private equity, infrastructure, and project finance. And before we jump into the presentation, maybe I will also hand it to you, Kate, to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be joining you today. I'm Tallant Meier. I'm the Interim Executive Director for TISFD, which you will be learning all about in this next hour and a half. So thanks for joining.
Thanks, Kate. So we can go to the first of the content slides. Thanks, Ada. Oh, maybe not that slide and not that slide. So we are tackling a global challenge, and well, I was going to present on the previous slide, but it's just a photo, so we can show you our vision right now. But before okay, thanks, Ada. Before getting into our vision, we thought it could be helpful to provide some context on where this initiative came from. And it largely surfaced during the pandemic when it became evident that investors were looking for guidance and more comprehensive and harmonized disclosures to help them understand issues around essential workers, racial equity, vaccine equity, and also system-level risks related to inequality. Around that time, there was also a significant number of investors who were starting to think of themselves as universal owners. You might be familiar with that concept. It's the idea that there are large diversified investors who are exposed to every industry, geography, and asset class, and they can't diversify away system-level risks. And they were recognizing that climate change is a system-level risk and increasingly biodiversity loss. TNFD was launched around that time. But also recognizing that inequality can be a system-level risk. And so the initiative was really, there were 2 initiatives. There was a TISFD focused on inequality, with the I focused on inequality, and TSFD, Taskforce on Social-Related Financial Disclosures. And we came together to launch TISFD. And the idea is that we can really harmonize existing disclosure frameworks and help investors also understand inequality and social risk in terms of system-level opportunities and risks. And we'll get into that a little bit. I do think it's also worth noting that there are a number of sources out there documenting investor interest in system-level risks. For instance, there's a great article in Forbes that we can put in the chat later with quotes from Ray Dalio of Bridgewater and Bill Ackman of Pershing Square, and also the Federal Reserve recently published a piece on inequality as a system-level risk to the financial system. And so we know a lot of folks are interested in understanding these dynamics, and we can put that in the chat. We can go to the next slide. So our vision is really an economic and financial system in which companies and investors effectively address their inequality and social-related risks, opportunities, and impacts, resulting in a stronger, more equitable, resulting in stronger and more equitable societies and economies. We can go to the next slide. So who are we? You can see on this slide that we have a working group right now. And again, I mentioned that we're a working group working to launch the task force. So we're not actually the task force yet. We're intending to launch the task force in September of this year, but the working group right now has a mandate to develop an inclusive governance structure for the task force because we don't want to replicate inequality in the process of trying to address it. We are also working on shaping the scope and mandate for the task force in terms of what types of materialities it will cover and how it will add value alongside the current standard setters. And so you can see that the group who's part of the working group that forms the working group right now comprises of investors, of companies, of civil society groups, of labor advocates from around the world. And so we also are intentionally working to shape this initiative, both in the working group phase and in the task force phase, in a way that has geographic diversity and diversity of lived experience and backgrounds and gender and many other features as well. So we can go to the next slide. So we have several deliverables, and this slide is a little wordy, so I'm just going to read it so that you can follow along, and I'll elaborate on each point. So first, we're developing a global framework for inequality and social-related issues that will recommend disclosures for companies and investors to communicate their inequality and social-related impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities. So this is the idea, right, that companies and investors have impacts on people. They are dependent on people for their business, for instance, customers or workers or community social license to operate. And also, these relationships with people can result in risks and opportunities for businesses and investors. And so this concept of impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, or IDRO, as the acronym, new acronym, has been forming, really spans across the materialities, from impact materiality to single financial materiality to even helping us understand system level issues and system level materiality. The task force is also intended to produce a body of evidence on the system level risks that companies and investors are exposed to because of extreme inequalities, as well as on the ways in which market actors impact people and contribute to inequalities, in turn creating a community of practice for existing and new research. And so this is the idea that, for instance, we have an IPCC for climate, but we don't have something like that for inequality. So thinking about how can we help aggregate existing research, commission new research, and so forth. Additionally, we are looking at providing guidance and recommendations on the implementation of the disclosure framework, the design of indicators and metrics, and the use of thresholds and targets. And so here, we're not proposing that we are an additional standard setter and that we're producing an additional disclosure framework, but you can see that we're looking to be thought partners to existing standard setters to help them improve their disclosures, to improve the market's understanding of social risk and inequality, particularly with the input of diverse stakeholders. And then in terms of the use of thresholds and targets, if you think about climate, we have a 1.5 degree threshold, for instance, when we think about what's a tipping point for climate change. If we think about inequality as a system level risk, what are the thresholds, what are the tipping points that we should be thinking about, and how should companies and investors be setting targets? Something comparable to science-based targets might not be possible to really have science-based targets for social issues, and they'll have to be designed, of course. Targets will have to be designed based on context and locality, but these are some issues that we're looking at the task force addressing as well, and some guidance. And then lastly, we're looking to develop an educational and capacity building resource that can be used by a broad range of stakeholders, including affected rights holders, to understand how TISFD's work and associated disclosures can be used. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that we are developing this framework for a wide variety of different stakeholders. Yes, for the market, so that companies and investors can understand their impacts on people and strengthen their identification, measurement, and management and disclosure of impacts and their associated risks and opportunities. But we're also looking to develop this framework in a way that supports rights holders to have better information and better tools to hold companies and investors to account for how they address inequality and social related issues. And then really working with standard setters and policymakers and regulators to support them on embedding TISFD recommendations into their standards, laws, regulations, and therefore we can support harmonization and reduce the reporting burden for companies and investors. So we can go to the next slide. I've mentioned harmonization, and so we really are looking to develop this framework. There's the task force, and then there's the framework that the task force develops. We're looking to ensure that there's interoperability with existing frameworks that are comparable. So for instance, TCFD and TNFD, not to mention the existing disclosure frameworks, for instance, ISSB, GRI, FRAG. And as I mentioned, we are really working to map existing disclosure frameworks, support them in strengthening their disclosures, identify any gaps, work with them to close gaps. In terms of system level issues, there's not currently a disclosure framework that's designed to help investors understand system level issues, so providing input there, and reducing the reporting burden on companies and investors. So we have frameworks on labor, we have frameworks on gender, we have SASB or ISSB for single financial materiality, we have GRI and FRAG for impact materiality. How do we help investors and companies make sense of this all? And also understand how issues move through the materialities through dynamic materiality. So we can go to the next slide. So I've already talked a little bit about materiality, but one of the intended value adds of this task force is really to help investors and companies understand impacts, dependencies, risks, and opportunities, so that they can more holistically think about what's material to their business or to their portfolios, depending on how they interpret their fiduciary duty and materiality. And we can talk about that more in the breakout groups. And we also recognize that there might be differences in views about what's an inequality related issue versus a social related issue. And so working through understanding what the differences might be or how they overlap. So we can go to the next slide, please. In terms of our work plan, we recognize that there is significant demand from companies and investors to have some sort of framework and guidance soon. So we're looking at roughly a 2-year timeline right here, where we intend to launch the task force, establish a secretariat, steering committee, and broader task force participation by September of this year. By September of 2025, so within a year, we anticipate having a beta version or versions of the framework to consult on, to pilot and refine. And that's following a period where we would define the conceptual foundations and build the disclosure framework. We anticipate publishing framework guidance between September 2025 and September 2026 and launching the TISFD initial framework at least and promoting and advocating adoption in September of 2026. We do recognize that inequality and social issues are very complex, and there might need to be additional guidance, for instance, sector-specific guidance or issue-specific guidance on certain types of inequality and social risks and opportunities, or guidance on specific localities. And so we are planning sometime following the launch of the framework to potentially work on those details as well. We can go to the next slide. So here I will hand it over to Kate to walk us through what we're thinking about in the governance structure.
Thanks, Delilah. So Delilah mentioned earlier that there's a conviction in our working group that we don't want to replicate inequality in the process of trying to create a tool that addresses it. That's really at the center of our governance principles. We have 5 principles. Inclusivity, so the task force will include balanced representation across civil society organizations, investors, labor, and business, and is also committed to ensuring diversity in terms of gender, geographies, and backgrounds. The idea of co-creation. So the task force will work closely with all of our members to gather feedback on the framework at key points in the process and the developed materials that enable the framework to be used by all stakeholders. We'll look a little bit more into that in the next slide when we'll go into the organizational chart and how we're thinking, how we envision that working. And it'll be really helpful to hear input from all of you on, if you think we have that right or how we might be able to improve that, because that's really sort of a core concept of what we're trying to do. So getting that right is going to be important. Of course, we need to balance that process of co-creation with also being efficient and effective in our decision-making. So leveraging the expertise of our member organizations while also being able to move forward, as co-creation and inclusivity is also something that takes time. So the balance is important. We will have kind of continuous learning and improvement throughout the process. What that means is that we'll have feedback loops. That's very much linked to this idea of co-creation as well. But that there's going to be sort of multiple ways to engage both with broader stakeholder groups, but also that we'll be looking into, for instance, how we engage at a regional level or a sectoral level. So we'll speak about that more in a moment as well. But thinking throughout the process of how we are not only gathering input so that we're learning various perspectives and feedback on what we're doing, but also then sharing that publicly so that we're transparent in our decisions that we're making and why we're making them based on everything we've heard. We can go to the next slide. Great. So this is our proposed governance structure. There are a number of key bodies to the task force. Ultimately, as you can imagine, a task force of this nature needs to be set up in a way that we can be looking across regions, across stakeholder groups in a balanced way. So with that in mind, so we've set up, the idea is that the Secretariat, I'll just go through each of these pieces and talk about how they relate. So the Secretariat is the full-time professional staff that's responsible for producing the deliverables and delivering them to the steering committee. The steering committee is the main decision-making body of the task force. It will be comprised of 30 individuals, and that includes 4 co-chairs who will serve in their individual capacity and come from backgrounds that bring that balanced perspective across our 4 primary stakeholder groups, which again are communities, investors, businesses, and workers. We've also thought about bringing in, how do we ensure that we also have the perspectives of policymakers and regulators as well as standard setters. So we're going to be ensuring that there's sort of a dedicated exchange through the Secretariat's engagement team in that process. And that sort of leads then on to the working groups. So there's a relationship between the working groups and the technical team in the Secretariat. So knowing that the technical team in the Secretariat is the full-time staff, that said, we want to be bringing in kind of expert views on various topics through our working groups. So the working groups are really this kind of site for co-creation within the task force. And in consultation with the Secretariat and with the Alliance, the steering committee will set a mandate for a working group. So for instance, around a specific topic like human capital, to look deeply into the work that we need to do there. The working groups then are responsible for shaping the deliverables, signing off on deliverables, very much in partnership with the Secretariat team. The Alliance then is the site for broad stakeholder involvement. We intend to set up regional hubs as part of the Alliance participation. So that will enable stakeholders to surface regional differences, advocate for TISFD on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. And we're also considering what that might look like in terms of sectoral representation, for instance, for global organizations. How do we bring that kind of perspective in as well? So some of the details of the Alliance, we're still very much in the process of developing. And I think as we go into the conversation, it will be really helpful as well to get any views from you on that. Lastly, we have the Stewardship Council. So this is our sort of main oversight body. The idea would be that the Stewardship Council meets twice yearly and is responsible for ensuring financial accountability, mission lock, and also managing any complaints that come from the I can never say this word, ombudsperson, that would warrant escalation. So that would be the body by which we would be able to receive feedback, manage complaints, and then that would go through the Stewardship Council. I think, yeah, I'll pause there. I guess maybe one other thing to say is you'll notice the lines here. We have the lines of accountability to the steering committee and Stewardship Council, and the lines of design and engagement between the working groups and the Alliance. I think that's just important to reinforce this idea of how we're thinking about co-creation, and then how we relate that to the steering committee having sort of this overall decision-making and strategic oversight function. Okay. We can, in fact, well, before, we're not going to go and break up, and yeah, we can stay here. So we want to just open it up for any questions from the group. We'll just have a Q&A session for a little bit before we jump into breakout groups, where we'll be looking to get your feedback on kind of two quite specific things, one around the governance structure, the other around our scope and mandate that Delilah spoke about. So those are the two things we'll be asking you to give us input on. So if there's any questions on that before going into those conversations, we'd be happy to take those now. And yeah, we have about 15 minutes or so for this. Thanks.
I'll stop sharing there so we can get a better look on the chat.
We can also jump into breakout groups if there aren't any questions.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So I will.
Ada, one quick question. Excuse me. I sent you the links for the two articles that I referenced, just on system level risks and inequality. So I don't know if you're able to put it in the chat in a way that everybody else can see. I don't think I have that functionality, but it might be of interest to folks.
That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Do that. I can also share it after the webinar and share it with everyone after. So
That sounds great.
Let me just organize the we just have a question now, so I'm going to allow Victoria Walker to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm on my phone, so I hope you can hear me on this.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the four sort of key stakeholder groups. So if I remember rightly, it was companies, investors, workers, and civil society.
Yep.
I was just wondering, what is the engagement with or input of governments around this? Because obviously they set the overarching policy framework within which all of this happens.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to know. Thanks.
Yeah, I'll maybe very briefly touch on this, and Delilah, you can build. So the idea is very much that the framework will be, will help to inform government regulation and the work of standard setters. So those relationships are really critical. I think within that, we're also aware governance being a part of the steering committee is, as governments change, we want to make sure that we remain neutral. So I think as part of the steering committee, we want to bring on board individuals that have that kind of neutral perspective. And I think the engagement then with governments is something that our engagement team and the secretariat and the co-chairs will be helping to support, so that we can ensure that as we build out the framework, it's fit for purpose and that it's something that can be taken on board by governments. Similar to same idea as following that kind of trajectory that TCFD and TNFD have had.
Yeah, and I'll just also build on what you said, Kate. I think in terms of government relations, there are a couple of obvious touch points, or maybe 3 obvious touch points. There's the regulators, financial regulators, who are looking for frameworks to integrate into their own mandates. There are also central banks who have a need to understand the emergence of system level risk. And so, for instance, the Predistribution Initiative is starting to do some work on around inequality and the relationship with price stability, right? Price stability is a core mandate of central banks around the world, and lots of times they think about it in relation to employment, but there might also be relationships with inequality that they should be paying attention to, and that's something where the task force can add value for central banks. And then ministries of finance. And of course, there are other policymakers and regulators around the world to engage as well, but those are some core areas where we're looking to focus, and welcome any feedback from any participants about where you think we can be helpful in that realm as well.
Thank you.
Thanks so much
Thanks.
for that question, Victoria. Okay, perfect. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to stop the recording, and then I will break us into breakout rooms. So